Uh, okay, we are back. Good morning. Or as a guy I met outside said, "Good morning, good afternoon, whatever." I was like, "Yeah, it's all the same." I couldn't remember how to talk because I hadn't spoken to anybody in some time. Okay. Um, all right. What is today's mug? Today's mug is Daffy Duck, who is looking peeved because he shot himself in the fanny and he's got a burned duck parts on the back. It actually turns out to be a horoscope mug. People who believe in horoscopes, it is surprising when you try to explain to them that all this has to do with the way that arbitrary chunks of rock are positioned in the universe compared to where you are on the planet. It's just, oh my god. Anyway, just have a little share rearrangement there. Okay, so I was talking about Tepper yesterday. Today, on to the next thing, which is a book called Gateway by Frederik Pohl. This is probably one of the best books of the 20th century. It was written in 77. Wow. Yeah, it's okay. I remembered it coming out in 1978. And it's unfortunate. This cover, I think this edition is still available. Oh, it's Del Rey. Okay, so wow, okay, the same people who hold the copyright for it who did back in the day. This is one of these perpetual bestsellers. The book is just always is always selling. The original cover was actually this painting by Boris Vallejo. It was one of the few paintings he did of spacecraft, basically, because he tended to be a fantasy painter, sort of after Frazetta. So Frazetta was the sort of Frazetta was an amazing painter. He became famous for painting Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan covers and things like John Carter of Mars and sort of, so men with lots of thews, as they call them, THEWS, thews, which are generally big muscles, and women with lots of thews in their chests, with small amounts of metal. This is such a male fantasy. So basically, they were sort of. This is where they got the look for Princess Leia when she's Jabba the Hutt's slave. So, whatever. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, but this is really a good painting, and the reason I'm pointing it out to you is that it is probably the scene of an actual painting of the last scene in the book. It's quite rare these days to have somebody actually illustrate a scene from a book on a cover. Sometimes you'll see it, you're like, oh, I guess that's the. But this is not bad actually. These sort of rocket ships or whatever they are taking off. That's okay. Then there's sort of the generic face looking up this guy's nose. I'm not sure why we're doing that. Anyway, there were a number of these covers this guy did. I wasn't a fan. But anyway, it's sort of the beginning of early Photoshop where they're like, whoa, let's just Photoshop something in there. Let's get some guy's nose in there. This guy used this person's nose and that person's eyes and those person's ear muscles, and you don't have to pay copyright to anybody. You can just get it from Shutterstock. And there's probably somebody down in the basement at Shutterstock is just taking pictures of just noses. They're like, go to the, go harvest just a nose. Anyway, okay. So the book is about Robinette Broadhead. Rob, Robbie, Bob. He's got all these names, and each one of these names, and he's called all these names. And the book is told as a series of flashbacks by sort of, as we learn almost right away, that Robinette Broadhead is telling his story once more to a psychoanalyst. But not just any psychoanalyst. He's telling his story to an artificial intelligence psychoanalyst that he calls Siegfried von Schrink. So it's this sort of wonderful evocation of Freudian. He's in strict Freudian analysis with Siegfried von Schrink, and he plays the kinds of games that I think are very common in psychoanalysis or any therapy, where the analysand or patient is trying to avoid dealing with the pain that they are suffering from. And that's what Robinette is trying to do. He's trying to avoid the pain. So in the course of the story, there are basically two stories. One is here in the present, which is actually the future. It's the future of New York, where Robinette has come back to Manhattan, and he's ridiculously wealthy. And he's made it, he's successful, and it's killing him, basically. As Siegfried says to him at one point. And this concept of the artificial intelligence is very interesting because it's well done, and Fred Pohl, who's the author, Frederick Pohl. Frederick Pohl broke a lot of barriers for literary science fiction, and he made a lot of kinds of different literary science fiction possible that John W. Campbell, who was the Astounding, then Analog editor, didn't prefer. He didn't like them, and he was like, what's that, So Analog, Campbell liked basically meat and potatoes science fiction stories by Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov and, or Arthur C. Clarke and hard science and so on, where the engineer is the hero and, American values save the day, whether they're in the 30th century or the 99th century, doesn't matter. An American is an American. And Fred Pohl was like, that's not me. And that's not us. And so he had a very different view of America. And as a result, he edited Worlds of If, I think, for a number of years, and then Galaxy for a while. For a while, these science fiction journals or magazines. They were basically they were monthlies, and you bought them and read the stories in them. And they were printed on. They were sort of holdover from the pulps, so they were printed on cheap paper. They were not that cheap, actually. They cost about $5 or $6, which was the price of a couple of books at the time. I mean, I remember, when I started to read science fiction, you could still buy books for 75 cents, 95 cents. 95 cents was actually a lot of money. $1.25 was like, what's that? Those had to be big books. So to buy a cheap pulp, a badly made, sort of prozine, as they were called, a magazine made by professionals, for $3 or $4 was a lot. But you were getting basically stories, all contemporary stories by your favorite authors. Okay. Anyway, so Fred Pohl was one of these very important editors, and he was also a very important writer. And he wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And he wrote actually a really fine, one of his finest books. He wrote many fine books, but one of his finest books was his autobiography called The Way the Future Was. And I thoroughly recommend it. It's just completely engaging. And he talks about how he becomes, he was one of the Futurians, which is a sort of group of writers, and yeah, including Judith Merrill, who became a Canadian and started the Merrill Collection. She basically gave her science fiction collection to the city of Toronto. So you can actually go to the Merrill Collection once the libraries are open. And you can see what became, it's this beautiful library. It's down on College, just east of Spadina on the south side. And it has two griffins out front, two big metal griffins. They're very good. And they're on the 5th floor, as I remember. I think the librarian is still Lorna Toulis. I don't know. It's a very nice library. I mean, and they have everything. They have graphic novels, and they've got, you want to see Japanese manga that I've been talking about. You can see it there. You can wander around. I don't know if they circulate. I think they actually started circulating books. Initially, it was just a reference library. When I used to go there, my sister and I used to go there in the early 70s. Well, Merrill was still alive, and she would be there every day. And so you could talk to her. So this is amazing because there is a living author, who was an award-winning science fiction author, and she knew she'd been married to 3 or 4 of the, I think, I can't remember, but she'd been married to at least one of the boys, because it was sort of a boys group. But this group, which included Fred Pohl, she was married briefly to Fred Pohl. They were all very young. I mean, they were in their 20s, and they all got married to each other, and they all went on writing. They collaborated. She collaborated with Cyril Kornbluth. Kornbluth and Pohl wrote a very famous book called, what was it called, Tim? It's a very famous book about advertising. I got The Age of the Pussyfoot in my mind, and that's not the book. That's a later book. It comes just before this one. The Space Merchants. And the Space Merchants basically is advertising. What would advertising look like in the 22nd century? I think it is. And the thing was that Pohl was nailing to the wall advertising in the 50s America, and it's still considered to be a classic, and it's still actually given out in advertising classes. Or it used to be. I don't know if they still do. Anyway. So Fred Pohl is an incredible literary force, and he went on writing. He died in, I think it was 94 or something like that. He went on writing. He was still writing novels. I bought one of his novels. Actually, it was like the 6th book that comes after this one. If you get interested in it, you don't have to. You can just read one and stop. I dare you to. We'll see about that. It's like to say about chips. Just eat one, but you can't eat just one. So anyway, so the story is told by Robinette Broadhead, who's in New York. It's the 22nd century, I think it is. And he is being psychoanalyzed by this artificial intelligence, who is actually very good. The artificial intelligence is a real character. That is, he is a really, truly sort of fully developed character. And he's very smart. And he's a very keen analyst. And he's no fool. And he knows Robbie's playing games. And so Siegfried, who is this, as I say, this sort of mashup of, Sigmund Freud and sort of Jung, but mostly Freud. But the sort of generic German, quintessential, early 20th century German, hey, what have you been repressing, Mr. Mr. Willy, Willy, yeah. But he's sort of like this. That's what Robbie would like to put on him, because Siegfried is a lot smarter and more astute than that. And over the course of the book, which is actually very short, and this is what novels used to be like. This is 270 pages. Man, this used to be a long book. I mean, these days, this is what I was talking about when I was complaining about Neil Stephenson today, is like 900 pages. How many novels have you really got in there? Like 2, 3? They're knocking around inside the sort of envelope of 900 pages. Jeez. Anyway, so Siegfried tells the story of going to a little asteroid named Gateway. And on Gateway, which has been discovered by some near space travel that the human beings have been doing, they find, it turns out to be an old spaceship terminal for the Heechee. The Heechee are an unknown race of aliens who we never meet. And they have left behind, for some reason known only to themselves, a planetoid asteroid, which they've hollowed out, which is full of ships. And they all have destinations programmed into them. And the ships are basically are classified by the Heechee Corporation, which the world planetary government basically takes over the asteroid and establishes a corporation to run and the ships come in 1s, 3s, and 5s. So a 1 takes 1 person, and a 3 takes 3 people, and a 5 takes 5 people. And they basically, all they know how to do is turn them on. That's it. and the ships are, and that's why this painting by Boris, I'm very fond of this painting. Actually, it's just very evocative of the thing. So these are 2 armored 5s, and this thing here is the lander. So sorry, you can't quite see it. This sort of dorsal fin here. Sorry, that's not dorsal, is it? The supinated fin. Ventral. There we go. Thank God for binaries. Yes. Every day I bless God for... Anyway, so the way you get down to a planet is... Okay, so basically, you get into the... So this is, I presume this is supposed to be Gateway, because it's a featureless, airless asteroid. So you get into one of these ships, or 5 of you. In this case, this is, I think, an armored 5. You get into one of the 5 people get into this ship with all the possible amount of food and water they can possibly jam in there. And they press the go button. And that's it. Because they don't know where it's going to go. They don't know how long the trip is going to be. They don't know where they're going to end up. And they don't know what they're going to bring back. And so the ship takes off, boom, and it goes faster than light. It goes through subspace and all that. And when they arrive where they are going, they get in the lander, which is this piece that is this ventral piece, and it goes down to the planet, if there's a planet. And then they come back up. And the lander essentially is a series of chemical rockets. But they have no idea how the ships work. So they just have to wait. And so the ships take off and they fly, and then they get to turn around, and they turn around and they start to decelerate, right? So the thinking about space travel is that since you can fly in a straight line, basically in space for the most part, you would accelerate half the distance and then turn around and decelerate the other half of the distance, because you want to get up as fast towards light speed, c, lowercase c is light, the speed of light. So m equals what? Jesus. What the heck? Now I'm trying to remember. Energy. Energy equals matter times the speed of light squared, right? So E equals mc squared. The c is speed of light, which is 186,000 miles per second. I can't, Jesus, I used to actually know this stuff. Anyway, I can't remember. Fast. And so the ship hits turnaround, and then they know whether they're actually going to have enough to survive, because they've got to fly out, turn around, get to wherever they're going, fly back, turn around, and get back to the station. So they have to have 4 times the amount of food. So if they get to turn over, and let's say they're flying and flying and flying and flying and flying and flying, and they don't hit turnover and their food begins to run out, there's no way they're going to make it back. So they know they're already going to die, right? So it's this very stressful crazy situation, which is completely unpredictable because they have no idea that the ships are full of telemetry and buttons and of all kinds of things. It all seems to be encoded by light, and they have no idea what any of it means, and they're studying it. But because they're desperate, because the human race is desperate basically to explore space, they pay prospectors, as they call them, a certain small amount of money basically to get in these ships and test them. Just go. So Robinette grows up in the shale fields in one of the old Rust Belt states. And it's very, I mean, Pohl is very perceptive. He looked ahead, he was like, okay, there's going to be an oil problem. Well, there was one in 1977 already. I mean, there was an oil, 1977 was, there was an energy crisis, as it was called, which was mostly geopolitical. It's not that oil was running out. It's that, because that we hit peak oil some time ago, but it's that there was, I mean, oil was always running out. I mean, this is a finite supply of oil. But it was geopolitical, OPEC, there's a big thing Carter was in. That was the end of the Vietnam War. So there was an energy crisis. And so suddenly America was burning coal again and so on. And so Pohl, who followed science a great deal and also was interested in mathematics, was one of the was very good at popularizing basically sort of science and, working contemporary science into what would this look like in 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, that kind of thing. So he's very good about that. Not in a preachy sort of way, just sort of worked it in. So he has this character come from an oil shale mine, basically, mining state. It may be Pennsylvania, which would make sense because Pennsylvania is coal territory. But they were doing, what he proposes is that they were doing essentially what is fracking. So they mine the shale and they pop it. That is, they heat it, they cook it, and they render out the oil, and then they use the oil, and they use the oil and they grow food on it. Oh God! So the world is overcrowded, and so I know all this sounds like a disaster, right? You're like, Tim, this sounds like a complete nightmare. Why? Like I'm living in a nightmare right now. Why do I? So I know, but just bear with me. Okay, it starts out dark, but everything it's just it's an amazing ride. So I recommend this book. If you're feeling a little depressed, read Sherry Tepper first. If you're feeling, hell yeah, I'm ready to, give me a good narrative. And like this is a good narrative. You will not put this book down. And it has a happy ending. Yeah, I mean, the hero doesn't die. None of our main characters really die, and one of them comes back. If you think, oh no, that's it for this character who I loved, she reappears and all is well. So it's okay. But the stakes are high, right? So these people are desperate. So he's shale mining, and he wins a sort of he wins the golden ticket, like the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory sort of Willy Wonka ticket to go to Gateway. So he goes to Gateway, but he's scared. And one of the things I like about this book is that it's an excellent discussion of anxiety without making you anxious. It's very perceptive about anxiety. And the things that we do to avoid anxiety, the kinds of, how we get engaged with the world. And, he has this girlfriend who he comes to really love, and he really, she really is something else. She's a real force. And she's better than he is. But they're both scared. And so they sort of beat on each other, and they sort of have crazy sex, and they sort of do everything they can to avoid dealing with the things that are, because they're terrified. It's like, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And so but it's very compelling. I mean, the characters are you're like, ooh, you're very they're you may not like them necessarily, but they're very sympathetic, and you feel for them, and as well, there's this sort of Pohl was really good at this sort of dry, hit this dry sense of humor, and yeah. Um, so slowly you get the story of Siegfried on Gateway and how he handles what he does, the people he meets, and he meets Joe Clara Morlun, who is the hero, really, I suppose. They're both heroes. He's an anti-hero, I suppose. I don't know. They're both protagonists. I mean, that's not about a book about heroes. I think it's a book about people. And it's very, very much a book about people stuck in sort of terrible circumstances and the way that they handle this particular. And the creation is it's just staggeringly intelligent, and there's just like everything is a surprise, and it's like wow. So all they can do is basically roll the dice, and they get in these ships, and so he gets the first trip out. He gets into one, and and off he goes, and he arrives safely at another station, and when he realizes that he's he's gotten up all his courage, and he's been terrified the whole time, and it all basically does is take him to another terminus. He's so enraged that he starts screwing with the controls, and he kills the ship, which is very unusual. And because if you screw with the controls and kill a ship, they explode. I mean, they think they disappear. People are never seen again. I mean, all kinds of crazy things happen. And so the Gateway Corporation is like, okay, you screwed up our ship, but now we know more about it. So they actually pay him a bonus for for screwing the thing up. There's also a very affectionate picture of Isaac Asimov, who plays a character named. There is a character named Dr. Asmention. And Dr. Asmention is clearly Isaac Asimov, who has been brought on as a consultant. So what Pohl does, and this is another piece of this book, is that he organizes the book very much like on a Dos Passos sort of modernist grid, although it's arguably a postmodern novel. I think it isn't. I think it's still modernism. I not necessarily had that conversation, but he fills the book with artifacts. So this is a poster from the Gateway Corporation that he has the classified ads that they post, which it says 1 armored bonus trip, sea launch captain. To go out in an armored ship suggests that the destination is dangerous, so they'll pay you more if you survive, right? and a lot of people don't, and so they finally go in this trip in 2 armored 5s, which they finally have been able to identify over the course of the narrative. Is their destinations are the same. So there are these 2 armored 5s that are they're going to go to the same place. Why? So they get 10 people to volunteer, and Robinette and his girlfriend, Jill Clara, go. And meanwhile, he's been telling his story to Siegfried. But Siegfried, we get his story too, because because there are times when Pohl puts in Siegfried's code. Now, this is seriously cool, because if you were coding at the time, if you were writing code in 1977, the likelihood is you are writing what looked like machine language. The languages like, I don't know, Fortran. Well, Fortran was, which was an IBM language, was picked up and modified by Waterloo. And so Waterloo, which is, of course, where all of our, where we expect sort of people to go who are good with tools, as George Carlin would say, good math and so on. And where RIM, RIM had its heyday and so on, developed versions of Fortran when they took a version of Fortran and they rewrote it called Watt4, Waterloo Fortran, and then Watt5. I programmed in Watt5 for a while. It was, what a tough language. And you had to program on punch cards. So you could only write one line of code per card. This is very slow business. And you made mistakes, and then when you put the cards in, they got chewed up by the reader. You'd have to go and type them again. It was so at the point that in the late 70s, they'd begun to develop programming languages that were much simpler, and they made much more sense linguistically, because Fortran and Watt4 and Watt5 were obscure. I mean, you had to learn the commands. There was nothing intuitive about them. I think we think that Control C, like copy, save, paste, cut, and so on, they just make sense to us. Oh yeah, Control C, Control V, Control P, Control S, Control V, whatever. All that stuff is just normal. Well, all that stuff has to be learned, of course. There's nothing normal about it. There's nothing natural about it. But the same is true with the whole language like this, where if you're going to make the machine behave and get what you want out of it, you had to do this stuff. And it was set up for math, really, and for solving big problems. COBOL was another one of the business languages. And PL1, Programming Language 1, which was an APL, which was Advanced Programming Language, which was for math. But in the late 70s, one of the programs that came out, which a number of us shifted to, was called BASIC, because it was basic. And it had the same effect on the programming community, on the people that I knew, not very many of them. It had the same effect there that C++ and C++ did, in the sense that it suddenly took over. Anyway, so this piece of code here shows you. So this is Siegfried's brain on this side, and this is Rob's brain on that side, right? So it's really smart. So what I feel I say for the thousandth time, so this is Rob in the session with Siegfried, is happy. I got no problems. Why wouldn't I be happy? We play these word games a lot, says Rob. I don't like them. I think there's something wrong with this program. He says, you tell me, Robbie, why don't you feel happy? I don't say anything to that. He persists. I think you're worried. Shit, Siegfried, I say, feeling a little disgust. You always say that. I'm not worried about anything. He tries wheedling. There's nothing wrong with saying how you feel. I look out the window again, angry because I can feel myself trembling and I don't know why. You're a pain in the ass, Siegfried. You know that? He says something or other, but I'm not listening. I'm wondering why I waste my time coming here. And of course, he's avoiding, right? I mean, he's doing everything he can. So then we have the actual comments. So the comment is, shit, Siegfried, I think you're worried. All right, Siegfried says, I think you're worried. And he says, shit, Siegfried, you always say that, And so then here's the rest of the code. So that's one of the things. And then there's a discussion with Professor Hegerman, who is another one of the sort of brains of the, and so he's a real smartass. And so there's a little news conference, basically. And there are found here classifieds, recorder lessons. Do you have a sister, daughter, or female friends back on Earth? I'd like to correspond. Ultimate object, matrimony. And here's a mission report. So there are all these real world objets that are sprinkled into the narrative. Really objects, they're not objets, but just objects sprinkled into the narrative to make the felt reality of the thing more, basically. And this is something which, at the time, film was getting here, so that the first film that had this sort of felt quality of life in science fiction was Alien, as much as it's splatter horror and so on. The ship, the designs for the ship, maybe I'll talk about this a little bit. Yeah, all of these things make for a background story. So you think there's actually a world there. And so this is an astonishing piece of what is called world building in science fiction. Other famous pieces of world building would be Dune. The Hyperion books that I was talking about would be obviously Lord of the Rings. Any fantasy world, Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones. By this time, the job had been done. Understood. By the time George R. R. Martin was writing Game of Thrones, we understood how to build worlds. Basically, this was still an issue where science fiction writers were beginning to use basically modeling and forecasting techniques that have been developed by the Rand Corporation and other think tanks to figure out so game basically how was the world going to work? What would things look like in 20 years? When this was happening, that was happening. So if you saw something like Ready Player One, Ready Player One is a sort of kind of loosey-goosey world building because it's not really like you're not actually going to have people living in stacks like that. They would just the stacks would fall over, it wouldn't work, But the idea is kind of nice. But these guys, and they were mostly guys. That's not true actually, because Ursula Le Guin, Leigh Brackett actually, who wrote the first Star Wars script, or did she write the script for Empire Strikes Back? And Ursula Le Guin, and a number of other famous science fiction writers, women, did very fine world building. Tepper, I think, is one. Le Guin, very famously in Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed. We might talk about those, either one of those. The Word for World is Forest, also very fine. The Lathe of Heaven. Le Guin was very good, partly because, I would argue, partly because she was just a very good writer and very bright, but also I think because she was an anthropologist, she was trained as an anthropologist, and because she was the daughter of Kreber, who was one of Boaz's students. And Boaz was, as you know, one of the sort of arguably one of the most important anthropologists of the 20th century, with Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and so on. Anyway, so this book is amazing, and it will keep you nailed to your seat, as they say. And if you read it and you think, I must know what happens next, it's like, well, not planning to have a franchise. There wasn't such a thing as a franchise in 1977. There were no franchises. There was one Star Wars movie. And we were like, that was okay. That was fun. I actually found Star Wars boring. I'm like, is that it? That's all that happens. Jeez. More story. Let's go. That's why the second movie was so much more satisfying. It was so much more beautiful too. Different discussion. And I'm trying to keep to my schedule here. I'm already over. Anyway, so if you want to know what happens, there are 5 books total that wound up being in the Heechee world. So does the human race eventually meet the Heechee? Yes. Is the main character that sort of falls into danger at the end of this book, and it's a cliffhanger, is she rescued? I won't tell you. And there I will leave you hanging. I seem to have marked another part in the book. Why did I mark that? No, I guess that's it. I think what's important about a book like this is that it's a very fine metaphor for the way that, or discussion, because I'm not sure that's a metaphor necessarily, but it's a very fine discussion of the way that human beings are caught in circumstances that are beyond their control, where they have very limited amount, there's a very limited amount of stuff that we can do, which should sound familiar right now. And we persist anyway. And this is one of the morals of the story of the Heechee books, is that despite the fact that it's difficult, people tend to persist. And that's a good thing to learn, to be reminded of, because you know it, I think, but it's good to be reminded of it. For many of you, this kind of event that we're going through now will be the first time that you've seen the world be set. Now, obviously, none of us have seen this kind of thing before, unless you lived through the 1919 Spanish influenza. But for me and for many, many people my age, we've lived through. I was talking to one of you about this the other day. We've lived through things like, the FLQ crisis, which I remember. I remember as a kid, we talked about it in the schoolyard. It was interesting how much that was part of our lives. The end of the Vietnam War, Watergate, which was puzzling, but all these adults were paying attention to this. What was happening? Well, later on, it turned out what was happening was that the whole system of government looked like it had been threatened and nearly had gone under. Of course, we laugh now. We look back at Watergate and say, boy, everybody was so, there was such decorum. There actually was belief that you actually had to obey the laws, even though Nixon had been caught, cheating and being a criminal. Well, he was a criminal anyway. He was a war criminal. But anyway, and then Reagan, and him and Margaret Thatcher, the stupid idiot, going at she went at the Falklands, he went at Grenada because they wanted to have a war. Really, that was kind of it. That was the only purpose. And then 1991, the first Gulf War. That was probably the first time as an adult that I'd seen, just like global stupidity in action. It was like, what is going on? And it was enraging. I was, and it was clear that it wasn't so much what the Americans were going to do, although they were obviously stirring the pot, but whether or not one of the missiles that Iraq was throwing was going to get through to Israel. That was the real nightmare, because everybody knew that Israel has the bomb. And what would they use it? I mean, would the United States be able to convince them not to? So that was 1991. And then 2001. And so probably for most of us, 9/11 is the closest thing we have to this, where things got turned upside down, and it changed the way we dealt with each other and the way we thought about security, what security is, and our politics, and anyway, all that stuff. So what I'm saying is that people persist. And one of the things about Gateway is that despite all of the dangers, and despite being afraid, people persist. And they survive. And then they need to talk about how they survive. And but the book is, I know I'm making it sound like a traumatic book, but it's not. It's very exciting. It's I don't know, if you liked Interstellar, I think I found Interstellar really boring. I mean, it's like, that's it? Come on, Nolan. It's like, you can do better. But there's a compelling quality to this narrative, and you will be very, very, like, keep out of my room. I want to read. So that's a pretty hard. It's hard to beat that.